Joining us now is my colleague, Kevin Pomfret. Kevin is based in our Tyson's office and advises a wide range of businesses on the legal and regulatory issues associated with the collection, use, transfer, and storage of all types of data. He has extensive experience in such matters as data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, SaaS agreements, data licensing, cloud storage, and artificial intelligence. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you, Fahar. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you everyone for staying on. I know Friday afternoon after a bunch of CLEs that discussion on data may not seem to be the most exciting thing, so I appreciate you staying on. Just before we begin, a couple of things. One, I apologize. I am struggling with either a cold or allergies, and so I'm sounding a little bit hoarse. The other thing is I did want to provide some background. I started out my career as a satellite imagery analyst for the U.S. government a bunch of years ago. And, I've worked, when I practiced law, I worked with a number of businesses that collect data, whether it be from satellite imagery or drones or other technologies. And what has been interesting for me over the past 4 or 5 years, if not a little bit longer, is just this migration, as is in the title of the, in the presentation, that all companies now, or almost all companies now, are becoming data companies because of the technology, because of what's happening. And frankly, that pace of adoption and change is going to increase with AI. And we'll talk about that a little bit here. I know we had an earlier presentation on AI, but it's just going to continue to grow, at least in my estimation. And just as an example of that, just the lead into this talk about how, clicking on buttons so that we can collect data can work on mobile. This won't work as well on mobile devices, but it does on web devices, and we'll send you emails. I mean, it's just the pace of change and the pace of data and who's collecting and who's using it and what it's being done is really fascinating to me. And I think it's going to be increasingly a legal one. So often data has been described as the new oil. I tend to think of it as an asset, and I think that's because of, like you, sort of a legal background. I just think about it as an asset, and as the lawyer, my job is to both protect its value and to minimize the associated risks with it. And I think that's a real challenge, because it really needs you to understand within an organization what data there is, how it's being used, who it's being shared with, how it's been collected, and then understanding what the legal regime is associated with it. And that's really hard in an environment where the technology is changing so quickly, the types of data are changing so quickly, and then the legal framework is changing as well. One of the challenges is, and I often when I give this talk, I refer to the Jurassic Park, when Jeff Goldblum talks about life finding a way. In my experience, data finds a way in an organization. It comes into an organization for one particular purpose, but often another group will want to use it, aggregate it, modify it, create a derivative work. Sometimes that's great, but sometimes the data isn't suitable for that. And it's, I think, the lawyer's job to sort of understand what's happening. It's no longer an IT issue. It's increasingly a legal one because of the risks and the value associated with the data assets. Next slide, please. So as I said, in my experience and my worldview, every business organization is now generating and collecting vast amount of data. And it's data from, some of the traditional ways that you do it, your internal operations, bringing in employees. Your customers are providing you data, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally. Your prospects, your vendors, your suppliers. It's just this whole new world of data that's being collected in a variety of different ways. We still use paper documents. We still send PDFs, fill out PDFs, fill out forms. But obviously the internet websites are increasingly a way that data is being collected, whether people who visit there provide the information to you, or whether you're collecting that from the devices, where they're coming from, what device they're using, how long they stayed, what they clicked on. There's so many different technologies now that are deriving information from people who visit or use your technology. You're getting it from your security, your cameras, your security on your phones, your security on your cards, your key cards that are coming into buildings. All of that is collecting data that is being used for, very valid purposes, but is also potentially to be used for other ways that may bump up on various legal regulatory requirements. We'll talk about that a little bit. Emails, telephone calls. I don't know if some of you have heard, I found this interesting, and it doesn't really directly relevant to this topic, but there's been some concern where people are able to generate phone calls to you just to get you to say a few words so that they can then use that data to create a likeness, a verbal likeness of you that can be used in an AI setting, or to trigger, convince other people to use your, to give you information because they think it's you on a phone call. I mean, it's just, this technology is just moving so quickly, and businesses need to be out in front of it. Mobile apps, almost every company now that I know of has some sort of mobile app, either using one directly for themselves or using some service associated with it. That is collecting a vast amount of data that a lot of different aspects of an organization is using. Web scraping, some of you may not be familiar with that, but in some sectors, it's a really big tool. It's technology that you create these bots, they're called, and they can go out and they just basically can, as the name implies, just scrape data off of websites. All sorts of information that they can collect automatically and then bring that back in and use it. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, the law around that, it sounds fishy, but the law around that is still very unsettled. And part of that is because some of the unique IP issues associated with data. Next slide, please. And it's important when we think about data, we think about data types of data, but whether from a legal, a technical standpoint, is it proprietary? Is it personal information that's being protected from data protection privacy standpoint? There's something called open data. Some of you may be familiar with that, but it's not data that's in the public domain, but it's licensed under open data licenses, which are similar to, if you're familiar with open source licensing or open software, it's similar to that. There are some challenges because data doesn't have some of the same structures as software. It's used in different ways, but I would not be surprised if there are organizations within this, on this call, who have people that are using open data for certain things around demographics, for mapping, much like they use open source software. And then you look at, is it regulated data? Is, sort of like health information, financial information, increasingly other types of information. It could be classified information, government information. All of these things are something that you need to think about as you have an organization, because as this data is coming in, it's being used in a lot of different ways. And the law, even if you think it's settled now, it is changing so quickly. And again, I'll repeat this a few times, but AI is a big driver in this. AI, the reaction to AI, because AI is basically, particularly the large language models that are out there, are based on collecting all sorts of data and developing these applications associated with it. And that is causing a lot of concern around IP, privacy, liability, intellectual property, national security, and some of the other issues. So that'll be a theme that'll run throughout here. This isn't intended to discuss AI, but I think it's something that's going to be a driver on how this evolves. And as I talked about earlier, every department now within an organization is using some sort of data. And so human resource, obviously, for employment data, the marketing folks are collecting data. Sometimes they're collecting it from the mobile devices, they're collecting it from the website, but they're also going out and getting the data from third parties that are helping identify prospects or customers, tailor marketing. So there's a lot of that. The IT folks are collecting data as part of their security controls and making sure that who's coming to the website, how long they're staying, making sure that everything is being complied with the compliance programs. Product development, developing products and services that can be used for different applications. Increasingly is being tailored around individuals and being able to make sure that you satisfy the requirements, and that requires a lot of collecting data. And then strategic planning. So the purpose of this slide is to just say, it's within an organization, you are finding more and more folks that are using data in their day-to-day work, and that without necessarily understanding the legal implications associated with that. Next slide, please. And it's stored in many forms, right? So you've got electronic, so you've got structured data, unstructured databases. which just means how the databases are set up, how they're organized. There's a lot of data in emails. We still have paper files, still have images. All of those are ways that data is being formed and shared and collected. And perhaps most importantly for this group is just it's really addressed in a wide number of agreements, right? So we often think about data being discussed in NDAs and what's required about who can disclose certain types of data that's being transferred in an NDA, who's responsible for returning it or destroying it, what's required in compliance. So there's a lot of attention associated with that. With data license agreements, sometimes there's data licenses agreements that your organizations will use, and people focus on data there. But it's also the legal issues are associated in cloud storage agreements. If you have a cloud provider that's storing your data, there's data being transferred, and you need to make sure that the agreements comply with your legal requirements as well as your information security and your customers' requirements. I have this line here as a service agreement somewhere. Some of you are probably familiar with a term. There's different technology, software as a service, data as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. They're all different offerings that are really making it much easier to get into using, storing, analyzing data. But they all address data in some way, shape, or form. And so you need to be considering the data aspect when you're looking at agreement. Similar with master service agreements, they often have to do with data in one way, shape, or form. And then in purchase agreements and M&A transactions, data is increasingly something that you need to consider. You're looking at the data protection privacy, you're looking at the intellectual property issues associated with it. You're making sure that the vendor agreements, the data is being used correctly. So there's a lot of issues that are being used, the data is being coming up in a variety of agreements that are important for lawyers within organizations to understand and be aware of. Next slide, please. So I think there's supposed to be a poll question here. Is that the next? Okay, yes. So here's a poll question. What is your biggest concern from a legal standpoint regarding your organization's data assets? Is it privacy, data protection? Is it cybersecurity, contracts, or license agreements? If you ask you to fill that out, if you remember, if you requested CLE credit for this, you must respond to each poll to verify your attendance. So please submit your response. Okay, can we see the results? So 44% of you say privacy and data protection, 51% say cybersecurity, and only 5% say contracts and license agreements. I think that makes sense. I think that's a pretty fair representation of where we are right now. You know, certainly data protection and privacy and cybersecurity are two big issues. I consider them in many ways sort of the opposite sides of the same coin. And so being aware of that, and there's been a lot of developments, particularly here in Virginia, with the Virginia Consumer Data Protection Act and a lot of attention paid to that. But I would recommend that you give some consideration and give some thought in terms of what agreements and contracts that you have and how data is being shared or access granted to those to make sure that you can, you're complying with your obligations, your legal obligations. So this next slide, one of the issues, and I'm not an intellectual property lawyer by training. So, and I know, again, this was talked a little bit on a call earlier today, or on the webinar earlier today. But my sense is, and what I'm seeing is that as the value of data increases in organizations, as it becomes more, the people are becoming more sensitive, there's a greater risk of litigation. Companies have always tried to protect their IP, obviously, and there are a number of different ways to protect IP, and I'm not going to go into those. But data is more complicated. And one of the ways it's more complicated is because the copyright protection with data is much more limited than it is with other intangible assets, such as software. So in a seminal case, Feist versus Rural Telephone Service, the case involves rural telephone copied a telephone directory of Feist publications, basically word for word. Feist publications sued them for that. And what the court found was that basically there was no other way to the data was facts, and there's no other way to organize the facts other than by last name alphabetically. So Feist did not have copyright protection over that because there was no originality, there was no thought, there was no creativity going into how it was done. And so that's some of the challenges with data. Facts don't get the same level of protection as other types of intellectual property. And while that makes sense, it raises a number of issues, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. You can get copyright in how you organize the facts and if there is some creativity involved in that. But the facts themselves, it's a very high threshold to get copyright protection on that. Another questions that come out fairly recently is the fair use doctrine. The Andy Warhol case, as some of you may know, involved a painting or picture that Andy Warhol took of Prince back in, I believe it was 1991. And then Goldsmith, changed it and claims that the copyright associated with it, it was transformative enough that it fit under the fair use doctrine, and the copyright provision did not apply. That is a little bit, the challenge of this is, that wasn't a data case, but it shows some of the challenges that we're getting into with technology to take data from one sense and then create it and transform it into something else. And where do the fair use lines draw? And there's a lot of questions and concerns around that in the data community, and I think we'll see more of that. And then there are other protections associated with data. There's the Trade Secrets Act, or Trade Secrets, the Uniform Trade Secret Act, the State Trade Secret Acts. You've got protection there. This case regarding LinkedIn and the web scraping case is an interesting one, because it highlights, as I said, HiQ Labs was going in and basically scraping LinkedIn's websites and collecting information on the LinkedIn members. And it was prohibited in the terms of use of LinkedIn Corporation. They brought an action eventually, after several years of knowing this was taking place. They brought an action against HiQ Labs on a number of different claims, including violating the contract, violating the terms of use. They brought an action on the Computer Frauds Act. They brought an action under California law. And there was a number of cases back and forth over the years, and it took several years. But at the end of 2022, the court said that LinkedIn did have a claim for breach of its terms of use, because the terms of use said that prohibited web scraping. Now, the response was, this data is not protected by copyright. It's being published on the internet. It's for anyone to use. But the court said that LinkedIn did have a claim under this act, and the parties settled after that. So there are some real interesting issues that are still associated with that. There have been several cases that are working their way through the system. But the challenge is, I would imagine, again, I expect that within this webinar, there are companies that have employees that are doing web scraping to collect information, maybe for marketing. If they're not doing it themselves, they may be acquiring data that's been from third parties that have done web scraping, because web scraping is good, and then to go out and get information about prospects or customers, and then you package it and then you sell it. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to sort of discuss this issue. Next slide, please. For me, one of the really interesting changes that has taken place is how data is being pushed further down into organizations for greater uses, for business uses, sometimes for real-time decision-making, sometimes for pretty strategic decision-making, without employees necessarily being trained data scientists or really understanding the limitations of data or the technology and what the risk could be. And so I think as this happens, and it's a natural consequence as this technology evolves, I think you have a greater risk of errors in liability. And so, for instance, some of you may be familiar with the ChatGPT incident where a company, one of their employees uploaded very sensitive information, company information, into ChatGPT to do some research or to answer some questions, and the company, was very concerned because now this information was in OpenAI, the host of ChatGPT. It was in their system, and the person who did it obviously didn't understand the implications, didn't understand what it was. But that's sort of what we're developing in technology. I think that we're seeing a lot of companies who are reluctant to use AI because of that. And I understand it, but I also think that the reality is probably happening in some cases without you knowing it, whether it's happening on your own systems or the person's individual systems. But other technologies as well are requiring data and understanding of accuracy, completeness, timeliness, all of those things are when making this decision. And I won't go into each of these different contracts, but are each of these different concepts of liability, other than to say, there are cases out there that have all the traditional sort of causes of action and concepts of liability, whether it be contract, product liability, tort liability. All of those do exist with data. And so I think you can expect to see more and more cases in this area, which is why it's important for you to know what your organization is doing and how they're using it and what decisions are being made on it, so that you can assess the risk associated with that. Next slide, please. So a number of you, said that cybersecurity, information security is your biggest concern with respect to data. And like I said, I get that. That's a big issue. It's being imposed more and more, as I see it, by bigger companies upon smaller companies. It's being imposed in a lot of the vendor-supplier relationships. Some ways it's really challenging. So for instance, if you have a SaaS agreement or some sort of agreement where you're only paying on a monthly basis a relatively small fee, but if someone breaches that and there's a data security breach, the implications or the risk could be pretty high from a monetary standpoint. Multiples of monthly revenue just don't make sense, right? So how do you go about sort of assessing what that risk is and putting a cap on it or allocating the risk? Where does insurance play into it? All of those things are part of this process. Many companies still don't have formal policies and procedures, in my experience, on these issues. Many that do, it's a very rudimentary. They don't sort of necessarily update it on an annual basis, which is one of the good hygiene practices. They don't, and the reason to do that is because the law is changing. The types of data that your company is collecting is changing. The way it's being collected, who's using it, the change in threats and technology are changing as well. So as I said, the spam calls that are trying to collect your voice so that they can use it in an AI situation, all of these issues are changing, and the laws and regulations are changing. And the one I have up here was just a recent change for government contractors, which can be a pretty broad group, on changing of, instead of sensitive information, but controlled and unclassified information, which is a broader set of data. This is the developments that is taking place on a fairly regular basis, and it's really hard to get out in front of it. So it's important to make sure that you do your updating so that you are assessing on a fairly regular basis what data we're collecting, what are the risks, what policies and procedures do we need. So for instance, biometric data, we'll talk about it in a little bit. Are we complying with law? Are we complying with best practices? And that's one of the things that I'm seeing on the information security side, and I tend to try to push back on it, but because of the way the law is developing, it's not necessarily what you're agreeing to comply with the law, but you're agreeing to comply with practices within the industry, best practices or common industry practices around data. And some industry groups have created these practices, these ethical rules, but you won't necessarily know who they are or what they are. You may not be party to it. So you need to be very mindful as to what you're signing up for when you're when you're agreeing to information security requirements, that you understand what that is. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, HR departments have historically understood the obligations associated with employment data, employment information. There's a long history of that, and we work with clients and understanding what that is. We have a strong labor and employment practice that works with that. But what we're seeing is with new technologies, this data is that these issues are becoming much more complex. One is simply because the laws are changing and the definitions of what's considered, for instance, biometric information can vary in addition to what the requirements are. Those of you familiar with the data protection laws, we'll talk about those in a little bit, we'll know that each state has something that's a little bit different. While there's some commonality, there's always a little bit different. It's even more complicated on the employment and labor side. So it's a very state-specific requirements that you need to understand. And as I said, the technology is evolving so that companies are collecting more, or given the opportunity to collect more and more information about employees through surveillance. And surveillance is somewhat of a term creates some negative implications, but it's one that's used in the civil rights, civil associations community to describe, what's happening and being able to track when someone coming into a building, to using GPS to track their vehicle, to key logging to figure out when they're at their desk, if they're working remotely, requiring them to sign in on certain requirements, and then collecting that and using algorithms to sort of make decisions based on workplace performance, on bonuses, on other types of things is a real challenge. And so just recently, 21 consumer advocacy groups, they wrote to OSHA requesting workplace standards for electronic surveillance and algorithmic management. So again, it's a very fluid situation and just another example of an area where you need to be mindful of what data is being collected and how your organization is using it and what laws you may be subject to. Next slide, please. And I think there should be a poll here. Yeah, so for data, number 2, data for internal operations, how knowledgeable do you feel about your company, how your company uses data for internal operations? Very knowledgeable, somewhat knowledgeable, or not very knowledgeable? I'll give you a few minutes again. I'm sure you've heard this quite a bit, but we've asked people to to do this in order if you've submitted CLE requirements. Okay, let's look at the responses. Okay, that's good. We had 20% say they're very knowledgeable, 61% saying they're somewhat knowledgeable, and only 20% saying they're not very knowledgeable. So almost 81% think they have a somewhat or good knowledge of what the data is for internal operations, which I think is really a good sign, right? Because that's the first step to understanding what requirements you need to have and how it's being used. Something that you may not often think about with respect to data that you collect, but it is one that I find of growing interest, are the national security implications associated with foreign governments getting access to data on U.S. citizens. Some of you may be familiar with concerns about the TikTok app, because it's the company that operates it here in the U.S. is owned and operated by a Chinese company that has been alleged to have close ties with the Chinese government, including some suspicions or suggestions that they're required to turn over any data that they have to the Chinese government upon request. Some states have banned the use of TikTok on state devices, mobile devices. There is actually a bill before Congress, and I'm not going to read the whole title of it, but that would ban TikTok in the United States. And there are a number of other apps like that, not necessarily run by Chinese, by the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Parliament, even Chinese companies, but that are owned by other companies in other countries that are collecting a lot of information on us every day. So you've got the security issues, you've got the data protection issues associated with that, but you've also got national security issues. And part of that has shown up in something, many of you probably are not familiar with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS. It's a process where, and there's certain requirements, you need to look at investment companies that are investing in U.S. companies, foreign companies that are investing in U.S. companies may need to get approval based upon the size of the investment or the industry they're investing in or the technology that they may be acquiring. And one of the ones within the past few years that became one of the triggers for a possible CFIUS process or request is it includes foreign investments in a company that maintains or collects sensitive personal data of U.S. citizens that may be exploited in a manner that threatens national security. So next slide, please. So here are just some of the types that are considered types of sensitive data that may threaten national security. Now, not all of these, not every investment in a company that has this data is going to be subject to CFIUS, but in my mind, it sort of highlights how we're seeing this development, not only from data from a privacy standpoint, from an IP standpoint, from a liability standpoint, but also from a national security standpoint, need to be mindful in terms of what obligations you may have. Now, and I didn't mention here because I didn't think I needed to in this particular forum, but there's also export laws associated with data, technical information, which also most companies that are in that field are at least mindful that they have that. So that's not discussed here, but this is just foreign investments in U.S. companies, whether it be an acquisition or it could be an controlling investment, and triggering some concerns over national security. Next slide, please. So data protection privacy was listed very high on the list here, and that makes sense. I think that's the one that most people are familiar with. This isn't intended on data protection and privacy. I think we talked about this last year or the year before, but it is intended to get you to think about, okay, there are new technologies that are raising new concerns. Artificial intelligence, drones, even balloons. I'm sure you're all familiar with the balloons that the Chinese government were sent over the U.S. a number of months ago, collecting information. There are U.S. companies that are doing the same thing here in the U.S., collecting information, and I can tell you that it is concerning government authorities, because first of all, you can't distinguish between a Chinese-owned balloon and a U.S. company-owned balloon, but also their ability to load those balloons up with sensors and collect information from a data protection and privacy standpoint is pretty significant. So that's something that people are thinking about, talking about. A number of states, including Virginia, have passed legislation on data protection and privacy laws. Each of them are a little bit different. This says 10 states. I think there have been several more. We had to submit this for CLE credit several months ago. So I think there have been, I don't know the exact number, but that number has increased. It's only going up until we have a federal law. And that's the last bullet there, which there was some discussion that maybe the American Data Privacy and Protection Act would finally get past this, would get past this year, and the U.S. would have a comprehensive federal national privacy law. That looks, given everything that's going on in Congress or not going on in Congress, that looks very unlikely this term, but it is still out there. It frequently, there's a bill that's introduced every year in Congress. Eventually, we're going to have one. We're one of the few countries in the world that really doesn't have one. So we can expect that. But until then, I think you're going to continue to see states passing laws, and businesses that do have operations in different states or collect data from individuals in different states are going to have to comply with that. And that's just an unfortunate part of doing business right now. And then the Federal Trade Commission, those of you familiar with data protection and privacy probably know that the Federal Trade Commission is probably the closest thing that we have in the U.S. as to a national or federal data protection authority. It has some authority under the FTC Act that created it to enforce data protection laws. Now, there's some discussion as to how far they can go on that. But last year, about this time, they issued some rulemaking trying to figure out how to deal with, I mentioned the commercial surveillance and data security rulemaking. They've held workshops. They're very interested in trying to understand all the different types of information that businesses are collecting from individuals and how they're using it and what individuals know about that. And so that's a real important issue that will continue to grow. Something I didn't have in here, it came out after the slide was done, but some of you may know that California is often the lead state on some of these things, and they've introduced some information and security requirements through an agency that they've developed there that have some pretty onerous requirements, particularly around data brokers and artificial intelligence. And it will be interesting to see if when those get passed in California, but if they do, how those sort of are adopted by other states or other government agencies. So that's something I would be mindful on the data protection side, in addition to just understanding what the laws are in the states that you have. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So I've talked about some of these technologies before. Digital twins is simply just creating using data to create another digital likeness of a building, of an object, of a city. It can be almost anything. It kind of, I think you can sort of see it like augmented reality in a way that is kind of the part of the metaverse, if you're familiar with that term. But it's using data in the real world to create a virtual world, and it raises a number of complex issues in addition to AI and biometrics, and some of them we've talked about here. And lawmakers and regulators are paying close attention, so they're looking at how can we, regulate this? What are the concerns? Again, there's this Health and Location Data Protection Act was something that was introduced in Congress that was trying to prevent after the recent Supreme Court decision striking down the abortion ban. This law would prevent the collection of location information near health facilities, so that you couldn't use that to identify location data from your mobile device to find out that an individual went to a health clinic, maybe to meet with a doctor about possibly getting an abortion or some other sensitive medical information. That hasn't gone anywhere, but that's another bill that's sitting in Congress. And then even at the local level, so the tenant data privacy law is a New York City law that gives tenants certain protections with respect to the data that's collected on them through their tenancy, including biometric data or data when they go into a building, into their apartment, what information is collected, how it can be used. So it's continuing to evolve and will continue to do so, particularly until we have sort of a national federal law associated with this. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just talk now a little bit. We've got about, I guess, 10 or 15 minutes left. I want to talk about how to mitigate these risks, right? We've talked a little bit about how the law is changing and how we need to think about what our organizations are doing, but how we mitigate it. Like with any other assets, how do we mitigate it? And talk a little bit about policies and procedures. I won't talk about insurance here as much, but I do think that that's something that companies need to think about in terms of how does their insurance cover the risks associated with their data. And then I'll talk a little bit about data audits. Next slide, please. Sorry, I thought we had a poll, but I guess maybe that's after the next. Oh, here it is. So how much data do you think your organization will be using in 5 years? Much more data, slightly more data, or the same or less data? Again, please, if you've requested CLE credit, please answer to this so that we can, make sure that you get the appropriate credit. Okay, let's see what the results. So most people expect that they will have much more data. I guess it's 99% of you think you'll have either slightly more or much more data, with 83% having a lot more data, and then small percentage you think you'll have about the same. I think that's about right. That's why the title of this this presentation. I think companies are going to be increasingly data companies, and it's going to be an asset within your organization, and you're going to have to understand it as such. And for me, that means, I mentioned the term data audit. I think it means understanding what the data supply chain is, what data is coming into your agreement, into your company, under what terms, and then how you're using it, and then how data is being shared outside of your company. Those of you familiar with data protection and privacy will remember the term data mapping, which is associated with sort of understanding where data is within your organization from a data protection privacy standpoint, so that you could know, okay, who has access to it? Can we delete it? How long have we had it? How can it be combined with other data from a data protection standpoint? I think this is more than mapping. I think it's more of an audit, and it's understanding the workflow of data through your organization, how it's can collect and obtain, how it's used, and how it's shared with third parties. And I make this the second bullet here. Often the person negotiating the vendor agreement, so if you're getting third party data, is not the same person negotiating the customer agreement. So if you're using that data and then you're creating products and services, or somehow sharing that data with another party, often from a legal standpoint, the person who negotiated the vendor agreement may not even know about the customer agreement. And an example that I like to give, and it's kind of a silly one, but it is a real life example about someone who had acquired vendor data to fish a certain type of fish, say mackerel, in a certain area of the country, right? But it specifically said they couldn't use it for trout, as an example. But in the customer agreement, they used this data, and they were licensing and marketing people to use it not only for mackerel but also for trout. The two groups didn't sort of align, and I'm sure no one thought of it, but that's the type of level of granularity that is happening in these vendor agreements, because these parties that are licensing data to you are often trying to just carve out what you can do with it, because they want to license the same data to someone else. And so that's why understanding what your requirements are contractually, regulatory, is really important. Next slide, please. So the first step in the audit is just how is data obtained? What type of data is it? And we talked at the beginning about all the different types of data, but understanding what the type it is. Are you collecting it yourself? Are you producing it yourself? Or are you acquiring it from a third party? Each of those have different requirements. And then what legal protections requirements apply, right? You've got regulatory and you've got contractual. So understanding what the data that's coming into your organization, I think, is really important. And particularly, as most of you said, if you're going to be getting more data and using more data, this is a good time to start thinking about that and being able to plan for that. Next slide, please. So then the next step is, okay, how is it used within the organization? Okay, who has access to it? Is the access permitted? Is there some controls associated with it? And this is going to vary depending on the type of data and the organization and the sensitivity associated with it, but there should be a process in place to understand what that is. It shouldn't just assume that all data is equal, or say, okay, all the personal data, we'll put over here, but everything else is okay. Understanding how it's used, what is created using the data, decision-making take place, is it accurate enough? Is it complete enough for that type of application? Are the people who are using it, are they trained enough to understand how to use it? Is it aggregated with other types of data? And if so, is this allowed? What's created? Who owns the intellectual property rights associated with that? And there's a lot of aspects associated with that. And again, going back to the AI example, a lot of organizations are going out there collecting data. To feed these AI systems, you need large amounts of training data to test them and to retest them and to modify them. And so organizations are collecting data. You may not think your data is necessarily important, but they're collecting the data and they're trying to use it in those ways. So being mindful of that, for instance, in your terms of service, and making sure that if you're comfortable with them, if they're going to store your data or process your data, are you giving them rights to use it for AI training? If not, you want to make sure that you exclude that. Similarly, if you're getting data from a third party, are you concerned that they've created this from AI? Do you want some sort of representation with respect to their compliance with laws? I mean, those are the sort of things, that's the world I think we're evolving to. Then looking at, okay, how long is it retained within your organization? How is it stored? And what are the contractual and legal obligations associated with that? Because those are going to be increasingly important as well. Companies are more and more saying, we want you to destroy this data. We want you to have information security in place. We want you to have a backup plan. All of these things are increasingly being pushed on vendors, suppliers, customers. Next slide, please. And then the third part of that is how is it shared with third parties? What contractual obligations do you have with the third parties? Are you making sure that you're passing on the obligations that your customer or your vendor has put on? Are you passing on the obligations that protects your IP? Are you passing on the obligations that protects data protection and privacy, national security? If it's an issue, liability if an issue, just how are you thinking about that? Is consent necessary, whether it be from a third party that gave you the data, or whether it be from an individual, if it's personal data? Has that been attained? In what form is it being shared? Sometimes it's important to make sure that you document what it is you're sharing and how you're sharing it, so you make sure that someone doesn't turn it into some digital copy they can use for something else. Thinking through the potential harms. In my experience, a lot of the folks that are using data don't necessarily think about the harms associated with it. And that makes sense. There's this sense in in the technology world anyway, that the data is this amorphous, no harm, just anyone can use it. I talked about the open data concept. I think that's a little bit naive. I think that's starting to change, but I still think it's out there. And I think it's important for lawyers to understand and train their employees, particularly in certain sectors, that that's not always the case. There are risks associated with a company. And then our appropriate requirements pass through, as I said, storage and security. And if you do have customer agreements, if you are giving them access to data, do you have notification requirements if there's been some sort of breach? Do you have rights to audit how they store the data or complying with the agreement? Is there indemnification provisions? What do those apply to? What is the requirement to return and destroy? Those are all some of the issues that I think we need to be mindful of when we're sharing with third parties. Next slide. Okay, that's all I have. We've got about 10 minutes for questions. So I don't see any questions coming up. I'm not sure if I'm missing it. Perhaps someone can tell me if I'm missing some questions.
Doesn't look like any questions have been submitted.
Okay, well then, maybe, and I when I was preparing for this morning, I realized I didn't really have a conclusion slide, so it's probably an opportunity for me to do that. As I said, I've worked with data companies for a number of years, and my senses and what I'm seeing in the market is the data is being collected from a wide variety of companies, being used for a lot of different purposes. The law is changing, technology is changing, and it's increasingly becoming less of a IT issue or a technology issue and more of a legal issue. And I think AI is going to be a big driver on that, both in terms of its potential and because of what it's going to be able to do for businesses and how it's being used, but also because of the reaction from a legal and a regulatory and policy standpoint. There are some really interesting cases that are developing right now around copyright. There's issues around data protection and privacy. And the US government is also getting ready to consider developing sort of broader executive policies around AI. The Virginia governor recently, just this week, issued an executive order around AI. So we're seeing that at the state level as well. And so there's this convergence of technologies and law that is really going to change, I think, how businesses see themselves. And if those of you who took the poll are right, and you're going to start using more and more data in your business operations, getting a handle on it is going to be increasingly important.
Kevin, it looks like we've got a couple questions that have come in.
Okay. Can you read them, Fahar? I can't see
Yeah,
them for some reason.
the first is there a state data privacy law that you would use as a de facto standard to try to build out your data privacy program, or are they all too different?
I think Virginia's is probably a pretty good place to start. California is by far the most detailed and onerous. Most states haven't gotten to that level. I think it's good to understand what California is requiring, because as I said earlier, they do tend to, people tend to follow them. But Virginia, a number of the state data protection laws are very similar to Virginia, and there are some nuances that you want to make sure you get right. But if you can get in compliance with Virginia law, I think the tweaks to comply with some of the other laws is fairly straightforward.
There's another question. Have you any experience with claims that a cybersecurity breach is a force majeure, either making or challenging them? And can you share any reactions about that if you do?
I have not experienced that myself professionally. I believe I have seen it raised in read cases, articles of cases. I don't think it's prevailed, but I think there is some distinction, that there could be a distinction as to whether the threat actor was a nation state or a criminal. There has been some, in my understanding, there's some distinctions in some of the insurance policies associated if it comes from a nation state and possibly could be tied to an act of war or an act of terrorism, as compared to just someone, is fishing around trying to get proprietary data, do ransomware.
Okay. And then I think the last question is, if conducting a data security audit, what would the key information points be for that audit?
For me, I would break it up in terms of how I tried to lay it out here, which is what data is coming in, what is that data, how is it being, how is it generated? Are you collecting it yourself? Are you bringing it in from third parties? Sort of understanding that phase, right? Step one, what data are we getting? How are we getting it? What type of data it is? The second step is, how do we use it? How do we internally use it? Who has operational control? Who has authority to make decisions? Who has access to it? What are we creating with it? Are people trained on it? Are people aware of the risks associated with it? Do we have policies and procedures to go with that? And then the third part is, are we using the data? Are we sharing it with any third party? Are we using it in our agreements? Are we creating products and services? Do our agreements line up? Are we complying with our contractual and regulatory requirements associated with information security? So I would look at it at those three phases, and I would think about it as, any other asset in terms of how that comes through, how it comes into the organization, how it's used, and then how it's transferred out.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, Kevin, thank you. I appreciate it. It was a terrific presentation. And at this point, that concludes our 2023 CLE Institute. Thank you again for joining us. As I've mentioned before, please keep an eye out for the email early next week with a link to view recordings of the sessions or download presentation materials. That same email will contain a link to a survey so you can provide feedback about today's program, which we would love to hear. You will also receive an email in the next few weeks from CEU Institute regarding your CLE credit. Please feel free to reach out to any of our speakers if you find you have any additional questions. We hope you enjoyed today's program. Have a great weekend, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.